Hello everyone, good day. I am Trisha Jill Vigiliana, and today we will be talking about the existentialism of Jean Paul Sartre. So now let's know more. Who is Jean Paul Sartre? So his full name is Jean Paul Charles Aymard Sartre, French philosopher, playwright, novelist, screenwriter, political activist, biographer, and literary critic. He was born on June 21, 1905 at Paris, France, and died on April 15, 1980. He is one of the key figures in the philosophy of existentialism and phenomenology, and one of the leading figures in 20th century French philosophy and Marxism. His father is a U.S. Navy and died when he was still a baby. That's why he grew up extremely close to his mother. Sartre spent most of his life in Paris. He has a wandering eye with a distinctive heavy glasses, and he was very short, which is 5 feet and 3 inches. He frequently described himself as ugly. His higher education were done at École Normale Supérieure from 1924 until 1928. From 1933 until 1935, he was a research student first at Berlin and then in the University of Freiburg. In 1936, he published an essay on the ego or self and a work on imagination. In 1938, he published his famous novel La Nausée, which will be further explained by Mr. Francis Stakes Vosotras later on. And then during the war in 1940, he published his second book on the imagination of L'Imaginaire. So the content of L'Imaginaire is Sartre propounds his concept of the imagination and discusses what the existence of imagination shows about the nature of human unconsciousness. Next is he was one of the founders in 1945 of a review Les Temps Modernes. So this Les Temps Modernes is a journal, a French journal, which is found by 3 philosophers, which is Simon de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty. So in his popular lecture, Existentialism and Humanism, which I will be elaborating that more later, which was published on 1946, he said that there are 2 kinds of existentialists, which is the Christian and the atheist. There are 3 philosophers who influenced so much in the beliefs and the philosophy of Jean Paul Sartre, which is first the representative of Christian existentialism. He mentions Jasper and Gabriel. And then the representatives of atheist existentialism, he mentions Heidegger and himself. In Karl Jasper's point, he was not a Catholic, came to prefer a descriptive label for his philosophy other than philosophy of existence. Gabriel Marcel was a Catholic, but he repudiated the label existentialist. So when we say repudiated, it refused to accept or to be associated with. So he doesn't like to be associated to become an existentialist. It may somewhat appear disconcerting when we find Sartre telling us that Marxism is the one living philosophy of our living time. What Sartre means by this is Marxism and existentialism. As a Marxist, he believed that societies were best understood as arenas of struggle between powerful and powerless groups. That's why. But it doesn't mean that Sartre has turned his back on existentialism and adopted Marxism instead. But in the next chapter will be discussed that he looks for fusion of the 2. So Jean-Paul Sartre really did his best to join or to mix the Marxism and the existentialism, a rejuvenation of ossified Marxism through an injection of existentialism. When we talk about rejuvenation, it is the action or process of giving new energy or vigor to something. So Sartre explained or defines existentialism by having this quotation. Man first of all exists, encounters himself, surges up in the world, and defines afterwards. And then humanism is the outlook that human beings have power to make freely willed choices to create their own values and determine who they will become. So as for Sartre, he believes that we are created in this world to be free from our choices because we are human. He put us here to be the shepherd of him, to be the follower of God. So many people doesn't understood what is the philosophy or what really is the beliefs of John Paul Sartre about existentialism. So here are 4 points about the keys of existentialism, which is further elaborated by Mr. John Paul Sartre. So first key is things are weirder than we think. All the things are surprising and sometimes frightening. To be a Sartrean is to be aware of existence when it is being stripped any of the prejudices and stabilizing assumptions lent to us on our daily routines. Like for example, try to think of having dinner with your partner. In Sartre's description, it is very logical. But a Sartrean would strip away the surface normality to show the radical strangeness. Looking beneath dinner really means that when you are part of the planet, span away from the energy distant hydrogen and helium explosion, sliced your knees on a strips of chopped top tree and put sections of dead animals on our mouth or in your mouth. So the second one is we are free. As what I have said earlier about the humanism, we are created into this world to become free. We're condemned to be free. Next is, number 3 is, we shouldn't live in bad faith. Sartre believed that if you are not taking freedom properly, he called it bad faith. We are in bad faith whenever we tell ourselves that things have to be a certain way and shut our eyes on the options. It's bad faith. That you insist that you have to do it or live with a specific person. The description of bad faith is in the book of Being and Nothingness, which will be more elaborated later on. And the last one is we're free to dismantle capitalism. Like for example, money is one of the things that discourage people to experience freedom. Most of the things people will do in order to gain a considerable amount of money is to go abroad, gaining a career, and getting a partner. To be pretending that he or she has a lot of money. It was like we are in a capitalism where people tend to become obliged to work, but it is denial of freedom. According to him, something other than itself, and in this sense transcendent, the transcendent object appears to or for our consciousness, and it can thus be described as phenomenon. It would, however, be a mistake to interpret this description as meaning that the phenomenal object is the appearance of an underlying reality to essence which does not appear. So, to elaborate more, like for example, in the twilight, I think I see a man in the wood and it turns out to be a stump of a tree. But The mistake, I know in myself that I made a mistake, but the mistake does not consist in my having confused a real thing, namely that the stump of a tree, with a mental content, the representation of man, which was the object of consciousness. I perceived an object, positing it as transcendent. In this example, we could detect that it made an erroneous judgment about the real object, but an imagination as a form of consciousness is intentional. That's it. So he is more concerned in arguing that just as perception intends an object posited as transcendent and not a mental content which stands in place of the extramental object, so does the imagining consciousness intend an object other than the image as image. So what Sartre means is seen most easily in a case such as my imagining Peter as present. When Peter is real but an absent friend, the object of consciousness is Peter himself, the real Peter, but I imagine him as present. The image or picture is being simply a way in which I relate myself to Peter or make him present to me. Reflection, of course, can determine between image and reality, but the actual first imagining consciousness intends or has its object as Peter. It is the imaginative of consciousness of Peter. In El Imaginaire, Sartre repeats the same basic point. To feel hate towards Paul is the consciousness of hatred, which pertains to the reflexive consciousness. For example, the emotive way of apprehending the world is transformation of the world. The substitution, though not of course an effective substitution, of a magic world for the world of this deterministic causality, but it is always intentional. The theme on emotion is always pursued in several sections of being and nothingness. We have seen that Sartre insists on the distinction between the pre-reflexive and reflexive consciousness. To love Peter, for example, is not the same act as to think of myself as loving Peter. In the first case, Peter himself, loving Peter, is the intentional object. The question arises therefore whether or not Sartre confines self-consciousness to the level of reflection. So the first order or pre-reflexive consciousness is regarded as accompanied by the self-consciousness. Sartre also added that there is no place in this consciousness for the ego. Now let's move on, which is according to Sartre, the ego is the me, posited as the unity to which all my state of consciousness, experience, and actions are ascribed, and posited also as the subject of consciousness, as in myself imagining Peter or myself loving Mary. Sartre distinguishes between I and the me as two aspects or functions of the ego. He also added that the me arises as an object for reflexive consciousness and the for consciousness, that is to say, which reflects on the reflexive consciousness.
Good day. I am Franciscus B. Vosotros. So, there are many books that Jean-Paul Sartre published, and I'm going to discuss the two of them, the Nausea and the Critique of Dialectical Reason. Nausea. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre published his philosophical novel Nausea in 1938. Nausea was his very first work, and it can be seen as the forerunner of Sartre's existentialism, which he was going to formulate in his work Being and Nothingness in 1943. So Being and Nothingness will be reported by Jeverlin or Paisa later. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre published his philosophical novel Nausea in 1938, in which it is about a man at the age of 30 who become increasingly disgusted by his own existence. His name is Roquentin, and he is the novel's main character and the narrator at the same time. By going through everyday life, Roquentin is regularly afflicted by attacks of what he calls his nausea. His nausea attacks embodies Roquentin suddenly aware of the meaningless and absurdity of lives. He feels that nausea whenever he suddenly becomes aware of the fact that there is absolutely no reason for living. He does certain things only because there is no reason for doing differently. Being disgusted and annoyed by his own existence, Roquentin tries not to think about existing, which he can't. He is nauseated by knowing that he exists due to his thinking of hating his existence. Life bores him and he tries to make time pass. Like for example, when he eats, although he is not hungry, just in order to pass the time. There is no reason or enthusiasm about anything he does, and the decision he made or still make appear to have only a passive character. According to the basic element that underlies the novel and the Sartre's existentialism, more generally is the matter of human's freedom. At one part of the novel, Roquentin says to him, "I am free now," in which he is not free, not more and not less compared to the all characters of the novel. "I do not have the slightest reason for living," Roquentin suffers for being confronted with this total freedom. Although he is the only one who is aware of this complete freedom, he is not able to take advantage of this knowledge. He is free, only in the sense of that he is really unfree. He is alive only in the sense that he is really dead. But in one aspect, Roquentins outperform the citizen of the town where he lives. At least, he does not pretend to be free as all the other citizens do. So, Sartre believed in a human freedom and in a free will. It's certainly true that the novel primarily shows and unmasks the human's failure represented by Roquentin of making use of the tough. Roquentin's freedom is of no use to him, maybe until he finally decides to write a novel. Nausea is depressing, but at the same time urging us to give our existence a meaning, because existence doesn't have any meaning as long as we do not dare to meet the challenge of facing our total freedom and accepting the following responsibilities. So there are important concepts in nausea. So there are two: the being in itself and the being for itself. So being in itself represents by the stone on the shore and the entire non-human world. Is that for being that has definable and complete essence, yet does not possess conscious and cannot be cognizant of its own existence. In soy, to describe things that have definable complete essence, yet not conscious to themselves of their essential completeness. This can be considered as trees, birds, rocks can fall into this category. Being in itself suffocates being for itself. Next is being for itself, in which poor soy. Pure soy or being for itself is a conscious and aware of its own selfhood and existence. Sartre uses pure soy to describe human beings who are defined by the possession of consciousness and more specifically, but their consciousness of their own existence. Sartre writes by their consciousness of lacking the complete, definable essence of ensoy. These states of being for soy, I mean being for itself, in which for pure soy is not just definable by self-conscious. It would not exist without its consciousness. So the next book that I'm going to discuss is The Critique of Dialectic Reason. So, according to Jean-Paul Sartre, Critique of Dialectical Reason offers a corrective to Marxism and demonstrates how his views on ontology and freedom can be synthesized with a new articulation of Marxist ideology. So the Critique of Dialectical Reason, published in 1960, it is Sartre's greatest attempt at synthesizing his existentialist philosophy with sociological analysis. In this work, his previous focus on human's freedom responsible is placed within a corresponding analysis of the specific structures of domination that humanity confronted in 1960. Sartre affirms that his own dialectical philosophy shares much with its two most famous exponents, Hegel, its originator, and subsequently Marx. He shares a basic understanding with Hegel and Marx of the dialectic relationship between man, the universe he inhabits. Simply put, Sartre echoes that these thinkers in writing that man exists mutually with the world. Man affects the universe, and in turn, the universe affects man. Sartre states that philosophy is born from this dialectic. The philosophy of the moment is simply the conscious of the ascendance class asserting its identity and seeking its freedom. According to Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom is not what you do with what's been done to you. For me, because there is no intrinsic and objective meaning purpose in life, humans are totally free with regards to how to live, what to do, or what to be. Our existence comes along with a conscious freedom and allows us to create our purpose and identity. This is why freedom is located in what we do. Yet, at the same time, we are affected by our environment, which shapes our intentions, identities, and purpose in life, accordance with culture, tradition, norms, and family. As a result, freedom becomes a phenomenon that consists of what we do and what's been done to us. Thank you. So, Jeverlyn Oropesa will report about choice and being and nothingness.
Good day, everyone. I am Jeverlyn Oropesa, and today I will going to discuss some of the works of Jean-Paul Sartre, which he is known to be a man of being. So Jean-Paul Sartre and the existential choice. When we say existential choices, those are manifest as generalized attitudes toward the world that both function as background for and are actualized by specific choices between options. So such attitudes are choices because we are in part responsible for them, and that because they are modifiable. According to him, that human beings live in anguish, not because life is terrible, but because we are condemned to be free. So we are thrown into existence and become aware of ourselves and have to make choices. So even deciding not to choose is a choice. According to Sartre, that every choice reveals what we think a human being should be. So according to Sartre, that man is condemned to be free. Because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. So a man is free to make his own choices, but is condemned to be free. Because we did not create ourselves. Even though people are put on earth without their consent, we must choose and act freely from every situation we are in. So everything we do is a result of being free because we have a choices. And for that, it simply means that we held accountable for everything that we do, for everything that we make choices, and these choices end up shaping what we become in life.
The existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre thought that human beings live in anguish, not because life is terrible, but rather because we're condemned to be free. We're thrown into existence, become aware of ourselves, and have to make choices. Even deciding not to choose is a choice. According to Sartre, every choice reveals what we think a human being should be. A penknife has an essence. There is something that makes it what it is. It has to have a folding blade, or it wouldn't be a penknife. Its essence pre-exists the actual penknife that someone makes from the design. But according to Sartre, there is no design for a human being. No way we have to be, no God to create a purpose for us, no human nature that fixes how we should live. In his 1945 public lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism, he declared that for human beings, existence precedes essence. That is the fundamental tenet of existentialism. I create myself through what I do, the choices I make in a world without fixed values. This makes me, me. I am what I do. What heightens the anguish, though, is that every sincere decision I take presents a picture of what I believe any human being should be like. In fashioning myself, I fashion humanity. I have to act as if everyone is watching me, and there is no escape from this.
So now, we will proceed to one of the emotional implications for Sartre, and this is the anguish. So when we say anguish, it comes from the Latin word angustia, or distress. It also translated as anxiety or angst. So anguish is the awareness of our own freedom. So it is in anguish that we become conscious of our freedom. So my being provokes anguish to the extent that I distrust myself and my own reactions in that situation. So my question is that what causes anguish in humans, and what ways do we deny this anguish? So to answer my question, the first one is that our choices are a model for the way everyone should choose. So if we deny this fact, we are in self-deception. So if we say that everyone will not act as I have done, so then we are giving a universal value to that denial. Also, we are responsible for ourselves. So we are the sole authority of our lives. We cannot give up this responsibility except the self-deception. So, we must make some choices knowing that the consequences will have a profound effects on others. And in choosing for ourselves, we choose for all humankind. So man experiences anguish when he realizes his freedom. According to Sartre, that for every man, everything happens as if all mankind had its eyes fixed on him, and we are guiding itself by what he does. So for instance, A political leader may experience anguish when making decisions about his country's economy. He must decide what his goals will be. Should he fight inflation or unemployment? What measures shall he take in order to restore economic stability? So these questions and others can lead a leader to experience anguish because the leader is conscious that whatever actions that he does take, he assumes the responsibility for the consequences for the country, his political future, and his personal reputation. And to Sartre states that anguish does not lead to inaction, but is the basis for such actions. So in short, it is the realization that nothing relieves me from the necessity of continually choosing myself, and nothing guarantees the validity of the values which I choose. So I have here the quotes of Sartre that says, "It is certain that we cannot escape anguish, for we are anguish." So a sense of anguish may be so overwhelming that man may relinquish his freedom by becoming passive and submitting to deterministic forces. And Sartre calls this behavior a bad faith. When we say a bad faith, it is the habit that people have of deceiving themselves into thinking that they do not have the freedom to make choices for fear of the potential consequences of making a choice. And Sartre calls this a logical error in judgment, because by refusing to exercise one's freedom or being dishonest, man is undermining the whole foundation of the human condition. Honesty entails that man recognizes the fact that he is free to create his essence, and that he constantly tries to fulfill that end. So as you can see in the picture, we all know that man is free. We are all free, and if we are all free, we can do anything. And knowing that you have an unlimited freedom, it can cause fear. And if you decide to ignore the realization that you had and live as if you are not as free as you truly are, then that's the time that you can encounter a bad faith. So the next one is all about consciousness. So when we say consciousness, it is the awareness of internal and external existence. And for Sartre, without consciousness, the world simply appears as it is without a meaning. Consciousness constitutes the meaning of things in the world, and things appear as intelligible system of separate and related things only in the consciousness. And for him, consciousness has two modes. The first one is the unreflective consciousness and the reflective consciousness. So when we say unreflective consciousness, this means that no knowledge but an implicit consciousness of being consciousness of an object, or what we call the pre-reflective cogito. And reflective consciousness is the attempt of the consciousness to become its own object, or the reflective cogito. So let us imagine that I am squatting down in the corridor of a hotel, looking through a keyhole. I am not thinking of myself at all. My attention is absorbed on what is going on inside the room. I am in a state of pre-reflexive consciousness. Suddenly, I become aware that an employee or a fellow guest of the hotel is standing and watching me. I am at once ashamed. So that is a reflexive consciousness. So for consciousness is precisely the negation of being. Sartre therefore draws the somewhat pessimistic conclusion that man is a useless striving. So why is that man is a useless striving? So for Sartre, he says it is because there is no meaning in life. Man searches and searches, and the gain is nothing but frustration. Man is doomed to fail because meaning, as such, does not exist. The message of Jean-Paul Sartre is that of despair, hopelessness, and anguish. If there is no meaning, naturally, man is a useless passion. So now we will proceed to what Sartre means by love, and according to him, love is a hazardous, painful struggle. So Sartre argues that a life is a hellish when a person becomes completely dependent for dignity on the judgment of others. This is also the primal reason why Sartre argues that loving relationships are doomed to fail. So love is a concrete form of the encounter with the other, and this relation is characterized by conflict. So in the next slide is a short animation or a video that shows the conflict and danger of love according to Sartre's perspective.
For Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom was everything. The lover wants to be loved, but not by someone who has taken a love potion. He wants to be loved by someone who has freely chosen to love him. The kind of possession we seek in loving someone else is completely different from the possession of a thing, because a thing can't possess us back. But for Sartre, the reality of romantic love isn't blissful mutual respect and a merging of freedoms. Far from it. Love is conflict. The loved person wants the other's love, needs her to help him reveal who he is, yet, in doing this, he risks transforming himself from a subject into an object, becoming a mere possession constrained by her vision of him. And it gets worse. As a loved one, the lover doesn't want his lover's love of him to end, doesn't want her to find love elsewhere. But that's not anything a free person could guarantee. Real freedom means freedom to change your mind, freedom to fall out of love. For Sartre, then, love is hazardous. It's either masochism or sadism. Masochism, when a lover tries to become what he thinks his lover wants him to be, and in the process denies his own freedom. Sadism, when a lover treats the loved one as an object and ties her down. Either way, freedom is compromised, and love becomes a painful struggle.
I have a short question here that says, why Sartre believed that the person in love could never be free? So to answer that, the freedom-minded Sartre sees the condition of love as a hazardous, painful struggle, one of either masochism or sadism. When we say masochism, when a lover tries to become what he thinks his love wants him to be, and in the process denies his own freedom. While the sadism is when the lover treats the loved one as an object and ties her. So basically, the masochism and the sadism are both about the enjoyment of pain. Because the masochism refers to the enjoyment of experiencing pain, while the sadism refers to the enjoyment of inflicting pain in someone else. Does love compromise our freedom? So the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre certainly thought so. To him, love was not a blissful merging of freedoms, but a constant struggle. When two people are together, they will naturally objectify each other, and each constraining the other. The result is that in a relationship, we either become submissive to others' notion of us or dominate them. So for Jean-Paul Sartre, freedom was everything. For him, the reality of romantic love is not blissful mutual respect and a merging of freedoms. Far from it, love is conflict. Real freedom means freedom to change your mind, freedom to fall out of love. And for Sartre, then love is hazardous.
Good day, each and everyone. I am Jennifer Mabayada, and I'm the second reporter. My topics are the early works and the ontology of being and nothingness. For the early works, it is an analysis of Sartre's written works, particularly in his methodology, his views about consciousness, emotion, ego, ethical treatment of his works. And for the ontology of being and nothingness, it is also an analysis of Sartre's work, Being and Nothingness. The distinct characteristic of Sartre's phenomenology, existentialism, is identified in terms of his methodology of his view of the self and of his ultimate ethical concerns. The analysis uses comparison of Sartre's work with other philosophies like Husserl. In his work, Sketch for a Theory of Emotion, emotion for him is a magical transformation of the situation, meaning subject or person may view emotion differently, but the feeling is not caused by conscious understanding. A mother, for example, may run because of fear of the danger caused by a snake, but not because of her consciousness. The essence of an emotion state is not inherent of the mental world, but transformation of the subject's understanding upon the world. In other words, an emotion depends on how the person understands it. In his work Psychology of the Imagination, Sartre described imagination as having internal structure, which is constructing to the tradition view that imagine is viewed to have a picture of it in mind. For Sartre, imagination is a form of directness upon the imagined object. Therefore, in imagining, there is an intention even if the subject imagined do not exist. In Sartre's Transcendence of the Ego, it illustrates how he defined ego. Ego is the object in all states of consciousness. This is in contradiction with Husserl, or in ego is a subject. With Sartre's definition, ego will obstruct all consciousness in the world and conflict with the direct nature of consciousness. With this, Sartre divided ego into consciousness of the ego and consciousness of the world. To illustrate, when I am conscious of a dog, it means directly conscious of a dog, but I myself am not an object of consciousness. With that, Sartre proposed to view ego as directly produced by consciousness. In other words, ego is a product of consciousness and not caused by consciousness. How can ego become a product of consciousness? Sartre elaborated it through pre-reflective and reflective level of consciousness. Pre-reflective level does not involve focusing. For example, if one sees a house, his conscience is directed to an object house, but does not involve ego in relation to an object. In other words, pre-reflective is impersonal, no attachment, no ego involved, but only awareness that there is an act of seeing. On the other hand, reflective consciousness is a type of state of consciousness involved into looking at a house. There is ego when I is brought into focus. In other words, when one uses reflective consciousness, there is ego because the subject I or the person has a focus into us in seeing, not just an act of seeing. Sartre's work considered ethical analysis. For him, Freud is wrong in his view that the unconscious has some psychological factors that cannot be understood by the conscious, and that this becomes the excuses of certain form of behavior. For Sartre, conscious acts are spontaneous and therefore the agent is responsible for them. For emotion, he considered it pre-reflective through spontaneous, so the agent is responsible of the transformation of his conscious through emotion. Sartre's phenomenology of existentialism is more on what is to be human. In his Existentialism is Humanism, it shows that one has to exist or be born first before he knows his nature, purpose, his being. In his being and nothingness, his approach in understanding human existence is ethical in nature because of his view that human has freedom, that he has power, free will to create his own values. Sartre's being and nothingness is an investigation into the nature of what is to be human. He identified two kinds of transcendence of true phenomenon of being. One is transcendence of being and the other one is the consciousness. This tells us that there are two realities. One is being of the object of consciousness and the other is the consciousness of self. With this, two types of being are identified, in self and for itself. Being of the phenomenon reveals reality. For Sartre, reality is that the world is a construct based upon the series of appearances. So if there is perceiving, there must be conscious doing the perceiving. For self, all there is to being is given in the appearance of existing object, or being of the phenomenon is giving focus or intent to what exists. The two types of being are in self and for itself. In itself, it is absolutely complete. It exists in a definite and non-relational way. This is equivalent to transcendence of the consciousness experience. For itself, on the other hand, is characterized by a lack of identity with self, purely nothing, no content, no meaning, no intent. As for the itself always transcends the conscious experience, its attempt to understand it within the conscious experience, it becomes a failure. Thus, it is not possible to identify the for itself since its basic form of identification itself is a failure. The for itself is a problematic state. It rejected the idea of considering all being in being. Considering that for itself it also exists, with that starts to investigate the nature of for itself. Nothingness is characteristic for the for itself. In other words, analysis of nothingness allows us to understand the for itself better. To illustrate, a dog is a dog, and the dog has no ability to change its being. Nothingness denotes absence. Example, to consider the idea that a camel exists in the cafe is logical if we refer to the world, but to say that a waiter does not exist is an objective fact. This objective fact is produced by consciousness. And that's all for my report. Ms. Jamil, take it away.
I am Alberta Jamil Shallow, and I'm going to continue the topic about Jean-Paul Sartre, relations with others in being and nothingness. So far, the discussion is about analyzing the for itself without examining how different individual for itself interact. Far from neglecting the issue of intersubjectivity, this represents an important part of Sartre's phenomenological analysis, in which the main themes discussed above receive their confirmation in an extension to the interpersonal realm. So since these main themes, being and nothingness, are already discussed, let us proceed to understand how each of us, the different individual for itself, interact with them. So we're going to discuss the two topics about the problem of other and the human relationships. The problem of other minds. Sartre examines main existing approaches to the problem of other minds. Looking at realism, Sartre claims that no access to other minds is ever possible, and that, for a realist approach, the existence of the other is a mere hypothesis. As for idealism, it can only ever view the other in terms of sets of appearances, but the transphenomenality of the other cannot be deduced from them. So in Chapter 1, Part 3, Sartre recognizes there is a problem of other minds. Question that how I can be conscious of the other. So looking at the two approaches to this question, Sartre claims that when we look at realism, we can never gain access to others' mind. For the realist approach, the existence of the other is a mere hypothesis. However, as for idealism, it can only overview the other in terms of appearances and cannot go beyond what our senses could do. So Sartre also looks at his phenomenologist predecessors, Husserl and Heidegger. Husserl's account is based upon the perception of another body, from which, by analogy, I can consider the other as a distinct conscious perspective upon the world. Sartre praises Heidegger for understanding that the relation to the other is a relation of being and not an epistemological one. However, Heidegger does not provide any grounds for taking the coexistence of dozens, being with, as an ontological structure. For Sartre, this establishes what needed to be proven, since other minds are required to account for conscious states, such as those of shame. This establishes their existence as prior. So Husserl's concept is that we can be aware of other people as another consciousness with a different perspective towards the world, but in attempts of accessing their consciousness through ours, it is impossible. This means that we do recognize that there are other beings with different perspectives out there, but we could not really grasp how they view the world with our own perspectives. So in other terms, we individual have different perspectives or panlantaw. So looking at the PPT, I have provided an example of a man looking seriously or focused on the keyhole of a doorknob. So Sartre raises questions such as, what is the nature of my consciousness of the other? Sartre gives the phenomenological analysis of shame. And it goes a little something like this. For example, when we are looking at a keyhole, all our focus is on what we can see in the tiny little hole, right? So our consciousness is focused on our own perspective from the tiny keyhole. However, when we hear the floor creak behind us, we become aware that there is someone behind us who might be in his or her perspective directly looking at our butt. Thus, by gaining a glimpse of others' consciousness, we begin to feel shame. This example clearly states that other minds are required for us to feel certain things such as shame or insecurity. Because if we are not aware that we are the subject of other minds might be looking or judging us, we do not become ashamed at all. Human relationships. In Chapter 1, Part 3 of Being a Nothingness, Sartre sees important implications of this movement from object to subject and vice versa. Insofar as it is through distinguishing oneself from the other that for itself individuates itself. Now, these terms, object and subject, might be complicated to understand in these sentences, but it's just simple actually. Like, when you're aware of yourself, that means you're the subject of your own mind. Each of us is an individual subject. But when you see, for example, as a cute child on the street, and you as a subject thinks of that child, then that child becomes an object in your own consciousness. By making others the object in your mind, you are distinguishing yourself from them. So more precisely, the objectification of the other corresponds to an affirmation of myself by distinguishing myself from the other. This affirmation is however a failure because through it, I deny the other's selfhood and therefore deny that with respect to which I want to affirm myself. So, the dependence upon the other, which characterizes the individuation of a particular ego, is simultaneously denied. The resulting instability is characteristic of the typically conflictual state of our relations with others. So, seeking affirmation for yourself in this way is not good. In simple terms, it is just like putting others down to lift yourself up. The resulting instability is characteristic of the typically conflictual state of our relations with others. So Sartre examines examples of such relationships are involved in sadism, masochism, and love. Ultimately, Sartre would argue that the instabilities that arise in human relationships are a form of intersubjective bad faith. Let's proceed to authenticity. If the picture which emerges from Sartre's examination of human relationships seems rather hopeless, it is because bad faith is omnipresent and inescapable. So, in philosophy, bad faith or mauvaise foi is the psychological phenomenon whereby men and women act inauthentically by yielding to the external pressures of society to adopt false values and disown their innate freedom as sentient human beings. So, in fact, Sartre's philosophy is a very positive message, which is that we have infinite freedom and that this enables us to make authentic choices which escape from the grip of bad faith. To understand Sartre's notion of authenticity, therefore requires that we first clarify his notion of freedom. Now, let's proceed to freedom for Sartre, authenticity, and an ethical dimension. Freedom for Sartre. In Chapter 1, Part 4, each agent is endowed with unlimited freedom. This statement may seem puzzling or confusing given the obvious limitations on every individual's freedom of choice. Clearly, physical and social constraints cannot be overlooked in the way in which we make choices. This is, however, a fact which Sartre accepts insofar as the for itself is facticity, and this does not lead to any contradiction insofar as freedom is not defined by an ability to act. To express this, Sartre presents his notion of freedom as amounting to making choices, and indeed not being able to avoid making choices. So, Sartre's conception of choice can best be understood by reference to an individual's original choice as we saw above. Sartre views the whole life of an individual as expressing an original project that unfolds throughout time. This is not a project which the individual has the proper knowledge of, but rather one which she may interpret or an interpretation constantly open to revision. Specific choices are therefore always components in time of this time-spanning original choice of project. So Sartre says that each agent is endowed with unlimited freedom. This statement surely is confusing given that we have vast limitations, may it be physical or social constant. However, Sartre's definition of freedom stays from the regular free to do anything definition. Freedom is rather to be understood as characteristic of the nature of consciousness. As spontaneity, to express this, Sartre presents his notion of freedom as amounting to making choices, and indeed not being able to avoid making choices. Sartre views the whole life as our own very big project. Their project, we do not know everything about it, and we learn and discover things about it from time to time. And the choices that we made as we go through these projects are our own. They are authentic choices, and this is what freedom means for him. Now let's proceed to authenticity. With this notion of freedom as spontaneous choice, Sartre therefore has the elements required to define what it is to be an authentic human being. This consists in choosing in a way which reflects the nature of the for itself as both transcendence and facticity. This notion of authenticity appears closely related to Heidegger's, since it involves a mode of being that exhibits a recognition that one is a dozen. However, unlike Heidegger's, Sartre's conception has clear practical consequences. With that in mind, moving on the topic of authenticity, with this notion of freedom as spontaneous choice, Sartre therefore has the elements required to define what is it to be an authentic human being. This consists in making a choice that refers to our own nature, this nature of the for itself as both transcendence and facticity. Our choices are not defined by the pressure of the society around us or by bad faith. Now, for what is required of an authentic choice is that it involve a proper coordination of transcendence and facticity, and thus that it avoid the pitfalls of an uncoordinated expression of the desire for being. Such a lack of proper coordination between transcendence and facticity constitutes to bad faith, either at an individual or an interpersonal level. So if transcendence and facticity is not coordinated properly, this will lead to bad faith. So such a notion of authenticity is therefore quite different from what is often properly misrepresented as a typically existentialist attitude, namely an absolute prioritization of individual spontaneity. On the contrary, a recognition of how our freedom interacts with our facticity exhibits the responsibility which we have to make proper choices. These are choices which are not trapped in bad faith. An ethical dimension. We pointed out that random expressions of one's spontaneity are not what authenticity is about, and Sartre emphasizes this point in existentialism and humanism. There, he explicitly states that there is an ethical normativity about authenticity. If one ought to act authentically, is there any way of further specifying what this means for the nature of ethical choices? There are in fact many statements in Being and Nothingness which emphasizes universality criterion not entirely dissimilar from Kant's. So Sartre and Kant's notion are quite similar, as both are focused on the ultimative value of a strong notion of freedom. As Sartre points out, by choosing, an individual commits not only himself but the whole of humanity. The values that are created through proper exercise of our freedom creates a universal dimension such that if I do these things to someone, will that be okay with if I were to be put in shoes? So sa Bisaya pa, if kung ako ang naa sa anang situation, okay ra ba nako? There is therefore universality that is expressed in particular forms in each authentic project. Contributions to existential phenomenology of what Sartre
So, if
later
Being and
refers to
Nothingness
as the
represents the
singular
culmination
universal of Sartre's purely existentialist work, existentialism permits later writings and albeit in a hybrid form. So if Sartre's Being and Nothingness represents his purely existentialist work, other writings are expressed existentialism as well. let us briefly examine how these writings extend and transform his project of existential phenomenology. So let us proceed to Critique of Dialectical Reason and the Problem of Method. Critique of Dialectical Reason. The experience of the war and the encounter with Merleau-Ponty contributed to awakening Sartre's interest in the political dimension of human existence. Sartre thus further developed his existentialist understanding of human beings in a way which is compatible with Marxism. A key notion for this phase of his philosophical development is the concept of praxis. So one thing that influenced Sartre to develop his existentialist understanding of human beings is Marxism. So what is praxis? Praxis is a philosophical term referring to human action in the natural and social world. It emphasizes the transformative nature of action and the priority of action over thought. It is said that social structures define an individual. However, as the individual grows and develops its own ways and sets its own goals, it negates what the society has already set for him. In Critique of Dialectical Reason, Sartre analyzes different dimensions of the praxis. In the first volume of theory, Practical Ensembles examines the way in which a praxis is no longer opposed in itself, but to institutions which have become rigidified and constitute what Serve calls the practico inert. So human beings interiorize the universal features of the situation in which they are born, and this translates in terms of a particular way of developing as a praxis. So one of the writings that Sartre used to develop his philosophy is the Critique of Dialectical Reason. In here, Sartre analyzes different dimensions of praxis. As we are born, we tend to bend to the universal features of the world. We grow up knowing that if we are ever to do something, it should be good as long as it follows the universal features of things, like how I cannot just slap someone, because if everyone were to slap random people, it would be very bad. This translates into terms of a particular way of developing as a praxis or our transformative nature of our actions. This sense now relates to Sartre's notion of singular universe of method. In this book, Sartre redefines the focus of existentialism as the individual understood as belonging to a certain social situation, but not totally determined by it. For the individual is always going beyond what is given with his own aims and projects. In this way, Sartre develops a regressive-progressive method that views individual development as explained in terms of a movement from the universal expressed in historical development and the particular expressed in individual projects. So by combining these methods of existential psychoanalysis with Marxist understanding of history, Sartre proposed a method of understanding human life. Conclusion. Sartre's existentialist understanding of what it is to be human can be summarized in his view that the underlying motivation for action is to be found, which is a desire for being. So it is up to each agent to exercise his freedom in such a way that he does not lose sight of his existence as a facticity as well as a true human being. In so doing, he will come to understand more about the original choice, which is what life represents, and thus about the values that are thereby projected. Such as understanding is only obtained through living this particular life and avoiding the pitfalls of strategies of self-deceit such as bad faith. This authentic option for human life represents the realization of a universal in the singularity of a human life. So that's all for the topic of Jean-Paul Sartre, and thank you for listening.